Hello everyone, I'm Barbara Rusch. I'm an historian with a special interest in all things 19th century. I'm an author and a playwright, and I'm making this video for the Homes and Everything series from HomeEquity Bank, providers of chip reverse mortgages. Today I'll be turning your home into a classroom by teaching you about another Holmes, Sherlock Holmes. And I think it's only fitting because, to me, Holmes is everything. Well, I'd like to start by saying that Sherlock Holmes is the most popular character in modern fiction. If you haven't heard of the name Sherlock Holmes, you've probably been living under a rock. In film, his character goes way, way back to the silent era, to the early 20th century, in film and in plays. And I'd like to show you this. This fellow's name was William Gillette. He was the first actor to take Sherlock Holmes to the stage, and this is a playbill from his first play, which was in 1899. And it was actually William Gillette who devised the deerstalker cap and the curved pipe in order that people could get a really distinct impression of who Sherlock Holmes was. So those were inventions of his, more or less. As well as in film, there have been dozens of plays written about Sherlock Holmes. This one is called Baker Street, and it was on Broadway. It was a musical in the 1970s. But these plays, as I say, go back far, far longer than that, and right up to the present. And I'm very proud to say that I have written a play about Sherlock Holmes called The Crossing. And so I'm very pleased to count myself amongst the playwrights about Sherlock Holmes. Well, there have been over 350 different films about Sherlock Holmes over the years. Probably the younger generation now would be familiar with these films. Robert Downey Jr., who starred in a couple of Sherlock Holmes films, and television series starring Benedict Cumberbatch, which was on BBC and PBS some time ago. There were several in that series. But what seems to be lost amongst all the hype over how sexy Benedict Cumberbatch is and how attractive Robert Downey Jr. is the original stories. The original 60 stories of Sherlock Holmes written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle between the years 1887 and 1927. And in these tales, Sherlock Holmes is the world's first consulting detective. But not only that, he is the world's first CSI, criminal scene investigator. And he is the first criminal profiler. So that is a distinction in itself. Now, we're all familiar with the props that distinguish Sherlock Holmes, and I've referred to a couple of these. His pipe. This is a wonderful one from my collection, and I have to say that aside from being a student of Sherlock Holmes, I'm also a collector of everything which we refer to as Sherlockiana. This is a wonderful meerschaum pipe carved in the profile of Sherlock Holmes. And we're all familiar with this icon, Sherlock Holmes's deerstalker cap. Actually, he would not have been that likely to have worn this cap while pursuing criminals and doing his investigations in London. This would be something that he would have worn out in the country. But again, it was William Gillette who popularized this deerstalker cap and made it a kind of emblem of Sherlock Holmes. But perhaps the most important one is this, his magnifying glass. And I cannot overstate how important the magnifying glass was to Sherlock Holmes's investigations. We have to remember that in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, there was no DNA. There wasn't even fingerprint analysis at that time. There wasn't no luminol. All of the forensic tools, which we take for granted now, did not exist at that time. And this is what Sherlock Holmes used to solve so many of his crimes, just this magnifying glass. And with it, he would gather up the evidence. He would go down on the ground and he would scour it for evidence of footprints. He would examine walls and ceilings. And with this very simple tool, he would be able to solve some of his most complicated crimes. I also want to emphasize that Sherlock Holmes often took on different identities. He was a master of disguise, and he would disguise himself as a plumber, as an old priest, as an elderly woman, as a bookseller or a sailor. And he was so adept at this that Watson once remarked that the stage had lost a wonderful actor when Sherlock Holmes decided to go into criminal investigation. Now, Watson, I want to talk for a moment about Watson because we can't lose sight of the sidekick. Every hero requires a sidekick, and Watson was wonderful. He and Sherlock Holmes met through a mutual acquaintance. They were both looking to reduce the rent that they were both paying, and so they decided to move in together. Watson was a doctor. He was recently retired, having been wounded in the Afghan war, and so he was on a pension, and he was looking to start up a practice in London. And he moved in with this very, very eccentric man about whom he knew very little when they took up rooms together at that very famous address, which was had come to be one of the most famous addresses in the world, 221 Baker Street in London. And 221B Baker Street, that's right. And here is a little illustration of the two of them walking in front of 221B Baker Street in London. But Watson became so much more to Sherlock Holmes than merely a roommate. He became so fascinated with Sherlock Holmes's cases that he started to become his biographer. And he began chronicling all the important cases. And then Sherlock Holmes began taking Watson with him to help solve these cases. And the two of them would go out together in the midnight hours into the streets of London and do their investigations together. So the importance of Watson to this story cannot be overestimated. Without Watson, we would not know about Sherlock Holmes because Watson chronicled them all, wrote them down in such an exciting and passionate way. Now, one of the most important phrases that we know about Sherlock Holmes, if we think we know, is when he said, "Elementary, my dear Watson." And that's how he solved his cases. Everything to him was elementary. It's quite simple. He could solve anything. Well, actually, Sherlock Holmes never said "elementary, my dear Watson." Where he said that was in the 1940s movies starring Basil Rathbone as Sherlock Holmes and Nigel Bruce as Watson. And that's when Sherlock Holmes said "elementary, my dear Watson." In the actual 60 stories, he did say elementary, and he did say my dear Watson, but he never actually put them together. But some of the things he said were equally important, of far more interest. For instance, he said, "You see, Watson, but you do not observe," which was really quite profound. He also said, "When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth." And that has really been the phrase that has been most associated with people who are truly interested in Sherlock Holmes and his importance in the history of criminal detection. I'd like to turn our attention for a moment to the creator of the Sherlock Holmes stories. And that man was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. It's a shame that his creation has somehow surpassed the creator. We seem to know who the writer of the Alice in Wonderland stories is, for instance, that's Lewis Carroll. We know who wrote the story of Scrooge. We know all about Dickens. Somehow Arthur Conan Doyle has been a little bit lost in the shuffle. I'd like to try and correct that, because I think that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was a fascinating man in his own right. Well, like Watson, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was a doctor. He went to medical school in Edinburgh, and he graduated as an ophthalmologist and set up a practice in Portsmouth. Put up a big brass plaque, Arthur Conan Doyle, ophthalmologist, polished up the plaque every day, and no patients came. And in order to fill up his time and also to try and make a few extra dollars, well, pounds, of course, he picked up his pen and he started writing Sherlock Holmes stories, and that was in 1887. How did a man who's studied as an ophthalmologist figure out this character? What was the inspiration? How did it come to him? And he had two major sources of inspiration. One of them was, surprisingly, the stories of Edgar Allan Poe. We tend to remember the stories of Edgar Allan Poe because of his scary ravens and stories of horror. But what we tend to forget is that Edgar Allan Poe wrote the very first detective stories. And that detective that he created was named C. Auguste Dupin, who was a French detective. And Arthur Conan Doyle was so impressed with these stories that he took these stories of Edgar Allan Poe as his inspiration. The other source of his inspiration was the doctor under whom he studied at the medical school at the University of Edinburgh, and his name was Dr. Joseph Bell. Dr. Bell was able to diagnose every patient just by looking at them and seeing what dirt they had on their elbows or their knees, or what their shoes looked like, or what the dirt under their feet was composed of. He was able to tell so much just about the character of the patient that Arthur Conan Doyle was extremely impressed by this and somehow adapted this talent that Dr. Joseph Bell had to his new detective that he created, Sherlock Holmes. Well, the Sherlock Holmes stories were not the only stories that Arthur Conan Doyle wrote. You may be familiar with the story The Lost World. that was a television series, very poorly done in my opinion, some years ago, and it was about scientists who went to South America and discovered dinosaurs that were still extant, that had survived through the ages. Does that sound vaguely familiar? It should, because that was the story, The Lost World, was the inspiration for Jurassic Park over 100 years later. So Arthur Conan Doyle also gave us that wonderful bit of literature. But in his opinion, his most important writings had to do with the chivalric age, the age of chivalry, knights on horseback, rescuing damsels in distress in medieval times. And he considered that his most important contribution to literature. And because of that, he decided to give up the Sherlock Holmes stories, which he considered kind of trivial and unimportant, and he decided to kill Sherlock Holmes off. That was in 1893, and he decided that he was going to devote himself to his historical writings. Well, how was he going to do this? And what he did was he decided to push Sherlock Holmes off a cliff. Not that Sherlock Holmes would just fall off the cliff himself. He had to create an arch enemy for Sherlock Holmes. And this was another very innovative literary device that he used, the arch enemy, in marked contrast to the hero. And Sherlock Holmes's arch enemy proved to be Professor James Moriarty, who had been a mathematics professor before he became the central character in a vast criminal organization. And the two of them met, Sherlock Holmes and Professor Moriarty, at the edge of a cliff at the Reichenbach Falls in Switzerland. And the two of them engaged in a life or death struggle at the edge of the falls. Both of them fell over the falls. And Arthur Conan Doyle thought he had solved his problem and gotten rid of Sherlock Holmes forever. Little did he know the backlash that he would create by killing off this very, very popular hero who already was beloved all over the world. Well, it turns out that people were so upset about this. The legend has it that there were young men who walked around with black armbands in London, through the streets of London, in mourning for the death of their hero, Sherlock Holmes. Well, Arthur Conan Doyle devoted himself to what he considered his important writings for the next several years, and then he had a change of heart and decided, possibly because Sherlock Holmes had become quite lucrative, and possibly because of popular demand, to bring Sherlock Holmes back, which he did in 1901. And he brought him back with the most popular of all the Sherlock Holmes stories, The Hound of the Baskervilles. Not only the most popular of the Sherlock Holmes stories, but considered one of the greatest horror stories ever written, along with Dracula and Frankenstein, the three most popular horror stories of all time, possibly. And everyone was thrilled, and Sherlock Holmes was back. So after that time, Sherlock Holmes only increased in popularity, and he has become, throughout the ages, a true icon of popular culture. And so what's the real reason? What is the reason for this long-lasting popularity? Why are we so attached to this character? Why do we find him so entrancing? Well, in my opinion, he was the world's first superhero. He even wore a cape, that Inverness cape that he had. But his superpower did not lie within his ability to fly through the air like Superman or Batman, but rather in his brain power, the ability to reason logically. He was the master of deductive reasoning. And that's why we admire him so much. He was almost like a walking computer. And the irony of all of this is that Arthur Conan Doyle himself was far from this. He was not necessarily just a man who was devoted to reason and logic. In fact, he believed in fairies. He believed in spiritualism, that the living can communicate with the dead, and he enjoyed going to seances and trying to reach people through mediums. At one time, he was very close friends with Harry Houdini, the greatest escape artist and magician of all time, and had a terrible falling out with him because Houdini felt that Arthur Conan Doyle was being duped by these mediums. And Houdini was devoted to exposing the fact that these mediums were just all fake. Well, so popular has Sherlock Holmes become that there are hundreds of clubs and societies all over the world dedicated to honoring him, to studying the stories, to organizing conferences and cosplay. By cosplay, I mean getting dressed up and as the characters in the Sherlock Holmes stories and engaging on that level. There are people who write pastiches, which are the stories that are written about Sherlock Holmes in the style of Arthur Conan Doyle, and I'm very proud to say that I've written one of these as well as scholarly articles and books that have been written about Sherlock Holmes. And here's one of them here, and I'm very proud that I was included in this one as well. In Toronto, well, I was saying that all over the world there are these societies, and in Toronto there are two societies. One dedicated to Sherlock Holmes himself, and that's the Bootmakers of Toronto. We hold meetings, we go to the racetrack, we have dinners, we really have a wonderful time. And we also are a very serious group in studying about the 19th century, about Victorian times, and all things Sherlockian. The other society is the Friends of the Arthur Conan Doyle Collection, which is headquartered on the 5th floor at the Toronto Reference Library, where there is located one of the greatest Sherlockian and Doylean libraries and archive in the world. We're very, very proud of this, and we encourage everyone to come down. The librarians, the curators are only too happy to show people around and the wonderful things, the collections that they have at the library. Well, if there's one message that I'd like to leave you with today, I would like to encourage you to read the stories. Go back to the stories. The films and the plays and the television programs, they're all wonderful. I would encourage everyone to read these stories. They're just so beautifully written. They're so fascinating. There's so much to learn from them. Read The Hound of the Baskervilles, the most popular, but there are others. There's a story of The Speckled Band is a great story. The Musgrave Ritual, A Scandal in Bohemia. Some of these are really enjoyable and worth your while. So I encourage you. These are some of the best detective stories that have ever been written. All of them can be found online if you don't happen to have a big book of Sherlock Holmes stories, and I encourage you to do that. Go do it. Do it now. Go.